Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorjan. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul is kind of fascinating because as we broach again upon the subject of where we're at in the Ukraine conflict, President Putin had a nice little Q&A session where, for all intents and purposes, he decided to challenge the West, particularly the United States and Europe, to a duel. We'll put our Orishnik. You can decide whichever target you want to be. You can put all the defenses that you want there, and we'll still come in and destroy it. And I thought that was fascinating in lieu of where we're at with the West allowing Zelensky to fire willy-nilly at will long-range missiles into Russia and what Russia's recent responses are, especially as some embassies were hit in Kiev. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this discussion. And it's pretty fascinating as the rhetoric is working at the same time that the actual physical conflict is going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, firstly, Ken, thanks for joining me as well. It's always a pleasure to get together. And there are some things we'll discuss that relate specifically to Ukraine, and some things that, whilst they do relate to Ukraine, sometimes it's an indirect implication. And this is the point you made, Ken, with regards to this kind of duel in inverted commas. I'm sure it was quite tongue in cheek in some senses, but again, it relates to this Orishnik intermediate range ballistic missile with, and I stress with, in inverted commas, nuclear capability. Obviously, it was being utilized once by the Russians to destroy a cruise missile factory in Dnipro. That was back in, I can't remember, sometime in, was it early December they did that? Or was it late? But anyway, it doesn't matter. And it definitely shook the Western world. We've talked about that previously, so we're not going to go into that angle. But yeah, it's interesting that Putin made this in his 4.5 hour address to the nation. And he made this comment that the West kind of is taking seriously, but trying to pretend not to take it too seriously because they're trying to downplay the significance of the Orishnik, because to admit it would be another kind of indication that Russia militarily is literally on the fly and during the course of this war developing new technologies that the West has no answer to.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that Zelensky, I think he's realizing, even though he's going deeper, in my opinion, into madness, he's realizing that Europe and the US are trying to divest themselves from this proxy war as quickly as possible. And we're getting closer and closer and closer to the day that Trump takes over. And I do not believe at all that he really is on the side of Ukraine, at least Zelensky in this, recognizing that not only is he not a uh, legitimate leader since they got rid of elections and pretty much put in an authoritarian state, but also the fact that he has to deal with entering into a situation where under him, I believe, the Minsk agreement was passed, and then the administration, the Biden administration, following this, threw it to the wolves. So the credibility of the U.S. in making any type of agreement when it comes to negotiations, Russia, they really can't trust this because they've seen in the past not only was it done under false pretenses, but once the Trump administration is done, even if Trump does have the credibility and the integrity, whoever is running the United States afterwards can just ignore it as willy-nilly. And as anybody who's done any research into it, the United States has broken every single treaty that it has ever signed, going back to the treaties with the Native Americans, treaties with Europe following World War One. It doesn't matter. So the U.S. really should not be involved in any of the negotiations of some type of peace agreement. And I think Russia knows this. Putin, of course, is not a hardliner, but he has to deal with hardliners, inside the Kremlin. And with that being said, once he started on this SMO, it's going to go through to the end. And the dictate is really going to be once we have accomplished all of our agreements, then we're going to stop. We're going to solidify our conquests or what we've gained. And, the West can do what the West is going to do. But in the meantime, while the Ukraine is still trying to keep the conflict going and, uh, wreaking havoc with the HIMARS going into a civilian population, etc. Russia is just going to put down the screws. And I keep thinking this winter is really going to be the end all of the conflict because the more infrastructure that is destroyed, the colder that the civilians in Kiev and the rest of Ukraine have to deal with this ongoing winter, the quicker the conflict's going to end or the government's going to be overthrown.
Well, yes, logically speaking, you would think that was true, but there's an element of desperation. I'll come on to that in a second. But first, it's worth just reiterating the point when Putin said in his address to the nation that yes, he put out a challenge saying, "Look, you put up your best missile defense systems, and we'll launch an Orishnik, and we'll see who prevails." Because his basic premise, incorrectly, is you have no answer to this. Now, of course, that's never going to happen. But he's doing that because it's just psychological warfare. It's just to make and unnerve people in the West to think, well, this probably is a game changer because they've done everything to try and deny the fact that it is a game changer. But there's another point worth making with regards to this negotiation process. And of course, Russia's made the point it's not just what we said at Istanbul, it's the reflection of the changes on the battlefield today and other factors. But Putin effectively, at this address to the nation, rendered Zelensky irrelevant in future peace negotiations because he said Russia will talk to Zelensky if he holds elections and gains legitimacy and will only sign peace deals with the legitimate president of Ukraine because effectively there were supposed to be elections in May this year. They didn't happen. And he's not really, in a legal sense, and according to the Ukrainian constitution, the government no longer exists in Ukraine. But here's the problem. For him to be re-elected, he would have to effectively be then in a situation where a ceasefire and an agreement was put in place. But if that was to happen, and certainly the United States now wants this, and several NATO countries want it because the prospect of this war carrying on is just too much for them to bear. But if that was to happen, he'd then be forced to hold presidential elections because the war would be over, and he'd certainly lose them. And everything now is about preserving Zelensky and only Zelensky. That is all he's interested in, which is why he wants to now lower the conscription age to 18, which effectively means you're going to wipe out or risk wiping out enormous amount of the population, male population 18. That was why is he doing this? Because he's desperate to keep the war going. He's desperate for more money. He's desperate for more arms. Because once the war's over, he's politically finished. He will not be re-elected. And that's all he's trying to do is preserve his own political status in the country. And another point that's worth making, just as a side issue with regards to Syria, is the United States is furious with the Israelis for going in and destroying all the military hardware that the Assad government had, because they wanted to ship that to Ukraine. Well, they can't now because it's all being destroyed in totality. A small side point, but another example where there isn't all this joined up thinking in the world in terms of what suits the United States in any way, shape, or form with regards to Israel and its policies. But coming back to the issue of Ukraine, it's extremely important to understand the fact that from Ukraine's perspective, many have long since wished the war was over. They will keep saying we have to back Zelensky because politically they have no choice. But Zelensky isn't the only Western leader who wants the war to carry on. They just are desperate to imagine that Russia is going to lose in some capacity or other. But when Callas, who's basically the senior diplomat now in the European Union, comes out and goes, Sirius proved that Russia is not invincible. So what are we supposed to believe? That they actually were saying Russia's going to lose the war, but prior to this, that Russia was actually invincible. And of course, Syria makes no difference to Russia in any way, shape, or form. So she's basically telegraphing in reality and admitting that Russia is invincible and we can't defeat them. But it's all about politics. It's nothing to do with the reality of what's unfolding on the ground. And therefore, you would have to argue that Ukraine's desperation in firing these ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles, which don't achieve anything in particular, they've actually caused far more damage just flying drones, kamikaze drones, which they've struck civilian targets. They're desperately trying to provoke Russia to cross the red line. They want them almost to declare war in the hope that if Russia goes full force against Ukraine, that is going to force Europe, it's going to force the United States and NATO countries to join the war. That's what they're desperate to do, and Russia does not have to do this. So when people get very angry and say Russia's being soft on Ukraine, they have to understand that if you're winning the war conclusively, why risk the wrath of escalating the conflict in a way that isn't going to change the course of the war, but it could cause enormous problems on an international stage and with respect to NATO allies and NATO countries. So we always have to factor that into our thinking as well, that it isn't always a straightforward situation where, well, this means this should happen. It's like the recent murder of Kirillov, who's obviously a general in the Russian army. He's very senior in the Kremlin, effectively. And he was very interested in assessing biolabs and chemical warfare and all that kind of situation. And he made a number of claims, and people are saying, well, the West trying to shut him up. Well, yes, they could, and they have, killed him, clearly. The Ukrainians have admitted to it. But it's not going to stop the research. It's not going to stop the revelations coming out. That, again, is an attempt to provoke Russia to go, well, this is a major red line because there's an agreement basically in the world. Doesn't matter who you are, you don't go around killing senior statesmen, although, of course, ironically, Trump did that with Soleimani in Iran, which people ironically seem to have forgotten about. But it's just a provocation to get Russia to overreact in the context of the war and do something absolutely idiotic, which then might cause so much political pressure it forces the Americans to do something they absolutely don't want to do. And I'm not saying it would do, but this is the desperation inside Ukraine. It's a desperation from Zelensky's perspective because he knows, and we'll come on to some of the discussion about what's going on operationally in the war in a minute, but he knows Ukraine has lost the war. But just because you know the reality, it doesn't mean you want to have to face that reality. And that's self-evident what he's trying to avoid, having to face that reality. But there's nobody in the Western world who, if you were to privately ask them and there was no repercussions, they would freely admit the war's over. But they're equally also terrified about their own future political careers because they've staked so much political capital and so much finance and weapons. I mean, they've depleted Europe's own missile defense systems, etc., in the process of trying to defend Ukraine and support Ukraine's absolutely futile war effort.
It's interesting that there's a big example in history of what you just said regarding Russia. obviously during World War II, Hitler was seriously defeating Britain by doing overnight raids and bombings onto their industrial capacity to do war. And they were probably very much on the brink of forcing Britain into capitulation. But Britain then went and bombed Berlin. And in the whole scheme of things, it really wasn't a big detrimental thing. Had Germany continued to do what they were going to do, they would have probably ended the Britain's part in the war within months, maybe even weeks. But because Hitler took it personally, he shifted the bombing from the industrial side to the civilian side and into London. And that, of course, saved what remained of the industry in Britain. It also boosted the resolve of not just the British people, but also the allies, the United States, who saw these civilians getting killed. And it was probably, along with attacking Russia, the biggest mistake that Hitler did in the war and led to their defeat. Same thing going on, of course, transferring that to today. Putin and the generals and the military have initiatives of exactly what they want to do. They they decided to do a ceasefire, of course, back in the time of the Minsk II agreement, but they learned that lesson, and now they're just going to go through, and it doesn't matter who's there calling for negotiations. They are going to finish the stipulations of this SMO no matter what. The only reason that it would continue even more is if Ukraine decides to push, and inevitably you may see Odessa get forced under Russian control, and most of Ukraine's infrastructure, as well as their capacity to even have a political office, much less military, could be devastated as well. And what remains of Ukraine becomes a wasteland that NATO, the vultures in NATO and the rest of Eastern Europe may want to pick over, but there's not going to be much left there to take.
No, there'll be literally nothing left. I mean, and yeah, they could if the war continues. They might end up taking everything east of the Dnieper, including, as you say, Odessa, Nikolaev, Kharkov, Sumy. Who knows? But I think there are rumblings coming out of the West that they're now going to have to, quote, make serious territorial concessions to Russia. And I think that's means over and above Kherson, Zaporozhye, and Donetsk and Lugansk. In return for some security guarantees, but security guarantees doesn't mean anything unless Russia agrees to what those security guarantees are, because otherwise that's just a backdoor way of saying, well, this is what's left of Ukraine, we'll put them in NATO, but we won't call it NATO. We'll initially give them the equivalent of Article 5 protection and put these security measures in place and rearm them, and Russia's going to say, excuse me, that's not happening. So there is still this idea, at least publicly, of trying to claim that they're going to dictate the terms of a ceasefire stroke peace agreement stroke ending the war, which of course is nonsensical, because the reality is that Russia will, as you say, will end the war as far as it's concerned on its terms. And at the moment, it is taking enormous amounts of territory along the entire continent. Language really doesn't exist anymore. It's completely fractured. But certainly in Donetsk, they are chewing up huge amounts of land. They're on the verge of really taking Pokrovsk, which is a key strategic hub, as we said previously. But the winter weather hasn't blunted their offensive. I think the West thought, well, once we get into November, December, Russia will have to stop. They haven't. They've just carried on relentlessly. I mean, because there's more than one way to fight a conflict. It doesn't always have to involve moving huge amounts of tanks and heavy vehicle across the terrain, which is true, is not conducive to try to do that during the winter months, because unless it freezes over in totality, when there is some evidence of it having frozen over in parts along the contact line. But the basic premise is Russia's taking more and more territory, more and more settlement, and it's relentless. And with regards to Kursk region, yes, they've certainly been trying to antagonize the Russians and firing missiles in the Kursk region, including ATACMS and Storm Shadows. But Russia seems as though they're just going to take a very measured approach to their response, which usually involves attacking critical infrastructure. And they've done that again in recent days. And I think in one night, they attacked 150 different locations. So it's a huge barrage in response to this. And this, of course, is also going to impact civilians. I know Russia says it's to thwart the war effort, which is true, but it's going to impact civilians. It's inevitable. That adds to the general complications they have with regards to energy supplies, which further risks just plunging Ukraine literally into darkness. And the casualty numbers for Ukraine just keep building up. They're losing at least 2,000 soldiers a day. And this has been going on probably most of this year, or at least 9 months of this year. So claims that Ukraine's lost at least 1 million in terms of deaths is probably true. And they've probably lost at least that much to critical injuries that no longer be able to fight the war again. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. We know in Kursk, they've lost at least 50,000 military personnel who've been killed as well. And a lot of those are their best military personnel. And now, of course, as you said, the ultimate reality check for the West is they're going to recruit 18-year-olds. I mean, this is absolutely absurd because it's going to make no difference. They are still running out of munitions. They're running out of finance. And obviously, they're running out of time because in basically 30 days, Trump's inaugurated. And okay, it remains to be seen what Trump actually does with respect to Ukraine, but he's gone a lot quieter. I think he's moderated, as we said in previous podcasts, his attitude to ending this conflict. But as things stand, Russia's clearly made its position extremely clear that it's not going to compromise. The West is trying to suggest that Putin's prepared to do that because they're just trying to soften the blow so Western people don't rightly say, hang on a minute, you told us we'd win the war, we didn't. We spent inordinate sums of money, which we desperately needed to have invested in our own countries because we're falling apart economically, financially. And you've basically exhausted Western military hardware in the process. I mean, countries have got nothing left to give, which is why they've been trying to beg the South Koreans against their constitutional right to provide weapons to a country at war. There's a lot of claims being made of the Ukrainians trying to give inducements to countries to try and provide arms and weapons. They're that desperate because they're essentially out of everything. They have nothing left to fight the war. Now, in terms of how long the war goes on for, we never put time frames on this because nobody really knows, but there is increasingly an expectation that it could be over in a matter of, months at the most, maybe 2 or 3 months, but you just don't know. I mean, the West wants to carry on trying to finance the war but in the end, they're going to run out of everything. And frankly, when you're starting to have to put 18-year-olds on the front line who are going to have no experience, that's way past the end of the line. I know people say historically, well, people were sent to 18 to fight World War II and World War I. Times it was even younger than that. That's not a justification. That is an appalling situation, which shows how badly, the war effort's going if you have to resort to sending 18-year-olds to the front line. And how long is that going to carry on before politically because it's certainly deeply divided politically inside Ukraine. People privately are furious and want the war over. They're terrified to say anything publicly because the country is run in a way that Western people simply would fail to acknowledge or believe. It's not a democracy; it is a dictatorship, and people are clearly had enough because they realise that Ukraine cannot possibly win the war. The war has long since been over, and the longer this carries on, the more of the country Russia will take, and the more of its infrastructure will be destroyed, the more that Russia will control the only resources worth owning, and there'll just be this rump state left that has nothing to offer the world. There is not. What are you going to invest in? There's nothing to invest in, and the country faces a very bleak future as a result of that. So we're really now on the countdown to when Trump becomes president. What will then happen? Will he take some immediate step? But I don't think he's going to stop financing Ukraine unless Russia agrees to things that Russia is simply not going to agree to. And we come back to the point that I think he's now realized, though his idea that he was somehow going to end the war in 24 hours is not a realistic proposition.
Yeah, and you have to wonder with the Treasury Department, Janet Yellen, and that uh, consolidating a loan to Ukraine based on the assets, frozen assets of Russia, if Russia in the end won't want their pound of flesh, either from Ukraine or from any of the NATO slash US countries who come to the negotiation table. Anyway, I think we got that covered for now. Obviously, there's going to be many more things between now and when President-elect Trump takes office and the ball really starts going faster. Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this discussion and for your great insight.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you very much for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think would be important. And until the next time to get together, have a great holiday.